Okay, so animating Unreal Engine mannequin from Blender. First thing I'm going to do is open up Blender and set the scene. So I'm going to get rid of everything and we're going to set the scale. I'm just going to use I just used UE4 tools quickly, and that sets it to 0.01 and in metric degrees. If you already have things in here in your scene, you could set them to scale at the same time using the ticky box up there. Then we're going to go into Unreal Engine because I'm going to just quickly show how to get the mannequin out of Unreal Engine without using UE4 tools. I don't like doing it this way. It's much easier to use UE4 tools, and there's a link for UE4 tools in the description. How many times can I say UE4 tools in one sentence? So we'll load up a third person project because otherwise we'll just have a bunch of arms if we do the first person. So load that up. No, it's in mannequin, character, mesh folder. We have the physics asset, the skeleton, and the mesh. We want to export the mesh out into an FBX, which it will do by itself. Just save this wherever the heck you want to. I think I just dumped it in the third person project that it came from. So export that as it is without really touching anything. And then we'll go back to Blender. And then when I finish messing around with the 3D cursor, we'll import that FBX. There we go. And there are a few settings here when I find the thing. Now I'm going to leave all of the main alone. I didn't do anything to that, I don't believe. And then tick all three boxes. Ignore leaf bones, force some bones to connect, and automatic orientation. So then we have this. If you don't tick those boxes, it comes through in much more of a mess than this. You don't really need to worry about those gigantic IK bones. A lot of the time these days, they're not really used. There's other methods using sockets you can use for IK in the engine, so you don't really need to use them. I just tend to just leave them alone for most things. Some people still use the hand IK thing for weapons, but I prefer to use a separate bone. Now, to get these bones into place, we're going to set the snapping, that little magnet looking thing down there, snap to vertex, and we can pop those bones to where they're meant to be. I learnt this from the UE4 engine forums some time ago. There's a little post about it. I might put a link to that somewhere. And then using active element, we can scale and snap the bones that aren't quite long enough into place as well, so that they look like they're connecting to their children. And I think that's about all I'm going to show with this, because it's much easier just to use UE4 tools. So yeah, you don't need those big old bones. You can kind of leave those alone for most things. And then you could set up your own IK rig once you snap this all together around this skeleton, but it's much easier just to not even hassle with this. Get UE4 tools and vandalize the rig in there if you want to set up your own IK from scratch. Just delete all the CS bones and a couple of, I think it's all the CS bones you delete. So in the UE4 tools thing, we'll import the mannequin as is, and we have the mannequin. Now you could animate with this rig, but you will come across some problems. The twist bones aren't set up at all, so bits won't move quite how they're intended to. And the spine bones don't mirror animation in Blender at all, because they have a bone roll. Their bone roll is offset from how Blender wants to read it. Blender likes either 0 or 180. 0 or 180 bone roll, you'll flip on the x-axis quite happily, as you can see. Then they have a bone roll of 90, so they're flipping along the wrong axis when we're trying to animate. I did make a video almost a year ago, I think, because I found a way of fixing this after animation with an F-curve, using the F-curve of the animation. But that's kind of irrelevant, because long since then I figured out that if I take all of these bones all these offending middle bones that don't want to mirror, select them all, and then we'll swap into edit mode in a second, and then we duplicate them. So we'll duplicate them, and we'll right click and just leave them where they were, because they want to stay in the same position exactly. We don't want to move them at all. Then you need to parent each of those bones that were duplicated, the ones that are now .001, to the bone they came from. Yeah? So we're sort of creating, I call it a sort of a ghost system, so that I can keep the bone roll as it's supposed to be in the engine, but still manipulate them for animation correctly in Blender. So parent all of those duplicated bones to the bone that they came from. They all need to have inherit rotation set to true, but I believe they should already all have that from being duplicated anyway, because that's what their original settings were. So then I'll come out from edit mode and I'll remove all of the custom shapes on the bones that have been duplicated, so that they're easier to see in pose mode. So I can swap between pose mode and edit mode to select them. So just drop off all of those custom shapes that were there. I was quite pleased with myself when I first figured this out. I saw it as a problem. It was something that was annoying me, having to go back through and manipulate F-curves every time I wanted to animate to the mannequin. So I sat down for about 45 minutes and thought to myself, how can I make these bones do what I need them to do without affecting the bone roll of the bones that are actually deforming the mesh. So this was the method I came up with, and I use it in lots of other animations now. So after I've got rid of all those custom shapes, I've parented them all where they're supposed to be. They all have inherit rotation. We're going to set the bone roll of each of the original bones, not the duplicated ones, the original ones, set their bone roll to 0, so that we can manipulate them in Blender. So we set all of their bone rolls to 0, all the way up the middle there. So I actually recorded this late last year while I was working on some free animations for a free third-person template project. There's a link down below. But things got a little bit crazy here, and now me and my daughter are in a more stable position. I'm coming back to it and doing a voiceover for what is 16 hours of footage that I recorded a little while ago, and it should all still be relevant. Yeah, we set those all to 0. Now we've got a funny looking mannequin, because all of those bones these aren't the deformed bones. These aren't the bones that are moving the mesh. These are bones that are moving the bones that are moving the mesh. So this is where the sort of clever bit comes in. Swap armature layer, and we're going to take all of those deformed bones that are actually moving the mesh, and we're going to tell them to follow, instead of the CS spine, neck, pelvis, head bones, we'll tell them to follow the bones that we've now duplicated respectively. So the ones that, yeah, you get the idea. And they all need to be manipulated in world space. All those constraints want to be world space constraints, following the bones that we have duplicated, because they have the original bone roll still, but because they are parented to our two bones that do not have the original bone roll, that have 0, that Blender can quite happily mirror, they will still they'll move where we want them to move them now. On my own rigs that I use, I rename the duplicated bones to ghost bones. I'm not sure if that's the correct term for this method. I know ghosting in animation is when things move where they're more than they're supposed to, or where they're not supposed to, but this is effectively, they are acting as ghost bones. I just stick them on a different layer and do whatever with them. Now for ease of use, I swap some of the custom shapes around on those CS bones that we're going to actually be animating, like actually be moving around. Because we're not even going to touch those duplicated bones. They just sit there and basically they just hold the information of the bone roll for us. So I swapped all of them to spine 2 because that's it was just the best custom shape to do it with, and then change the scale of them slightly so I can see where they are and move them around the place. So everything's pointing the right way. And that is how I fixed the spine. Made it mirror animation properly. And now when we move these bones, they move the bones that we have parented to them, which have the correct bone roll, and they are the bones that the deformed bones are following, but they will now, these bones that we're actually manipulating and trying to flip on the x-axis will flip on the x-axis. So yeah, I was quite proud with figuring that out. I use it for a few other different things as well, actually, when I need to have bones following bone roll at funny angles and stuff, different IK setups for specific body parts if you're working with anatomical stuff like actual skeletons and muscles and things. Now onto the twist bones. This is one of the first things I learned about animation, like animating humanoids and characters, was the upper arm twist is just a damp track onto a point at the elbow. You could use the head of the lower arm bone, but I use the tail of the upper arm bone that it's parented to. And it doesn't have inherent rotation. So it's tracking to, effectively the elbow, the tail of the upper arm bone. And then when you move the arm around, it doesn't rotate on its y-axis, which holds the shoulder in place. At least for the way the mannequin's weighted, as you can see there. So that's the upper arm twist, nice and simple. Now the lower arm twist, I'm not too fond of this method of doing it, but this is one of a few, and most of the ways that people do this for animation is so far from how a human arm works, it's unreal. But for the mannequin, it's fine. So that lower arm twist is just going to copy rotation of the hand bone. I believe, yep, the CS hand bone. Or no, I did the actual hand bone. Yeah, the actual hand bone. And then in local space, but only the y-axis. We don't want to copy the x or the z-axis of it. And I think we lower the influence of it because we don't want it to follow it exactly, because we want to leave a little bit of pull there. Now on the mannequin, the wrist is a ball and socket joint, which the wrist is not a ball and socket joint, so it doesn't really work very well. But for the mannequin, I just do this sort of choppy method of adding a limit rotation, because from the UE4 Tools rig, it copies the IK hand, which again I don't really agree with, and I don't use it like that usually, only on the mannequin. And then I just chuck in some numbers here. You could do whatever you wanted with them. These are the rough. This is roughly where your wrist could move to if it was like the mannequin's wrist. So yeah, we put that in on local space for transform. You want to be clicking that, otherwise keyframes won't go through properly if you needed them to. And then we have, it's a bit jerky, and I'm going to play around with the arm in just a second. There we go, because I was like, why am I jerking around the place? Then I realised I didn't set the influence slightly lower, but there needs to be a bit of slack there to use it like this. So when I'm done fiddling around there, I figure out that I just want to drop that influence there on the copy constraint there. Yeah, on the limit. The limit wants to be just below 1, so you have a bit of slack there. It stops it popping so much. Now, using the hands like this isn't really the best way of doing it. It'd be better to get rid of the copy rotation and the limit rotation on that CS hand bone and manipulate the hand as a separate entity. Okay, thigh twist, very simple again, just the same as the upper arm twist. Tracking, I set it to track to the tail of the thigh elbow that it's parented to, and it holds pretty much the same position as well. So yeah, just a damp track to follow it, and then so you can see the inherent rotation, because it's a bit more subtle on the thigh. So you can see the difference. There's the inherent rotation, we turn that off, and the top of the thigh gets held back in place slightly, which is what we want it to do. Now you could set the influence, you can change the influence for both of those, both the upper arm twist and the thigh twist. You could set those influences differently, so you could have it tighter or looser to the animation. Now the calf twist is Actually, not necessary. You could probably leave this alone for most animation you do with the mannequin because of the way the ankle is treated on it. But I wanted to do something with it, at least. So I did this method where it just copies the IK foot, because the IK foot bone is actually on a very similar... It's pointing the same way. Okay, it's got a custom shape there, but it's actually pointing down. So I have it following that, but only its y-axis, just like the wrist. Very similar to the lower arm of the wrist there. It just copies it with slightly less influence, and I put a limit rotation on it as well, because we don't want it to follow the ankle all the way around, or you'll get clipping where the top of the calf stays and where the ankle meets the leg, it joins. So just a little limit rotation with a few numbers there you can plug in, do your own thing with those. Always click the 4 transform there. And yeah, drop the influence of that slightly, otherwise, to avoid the same jerky motions, which aren't really too much of a problem for a lot of basic animation, but as soon as you start getting Mr. Mannequin doing somersaults, you'll have problems with tight constraints, like I messed around with the wrist there. So yeah, you see the bottom of the leg just follows the foot slightly, and that worked. I just preferred it that way, so I did it that way. So we'll go all the way back up, the twist bones on the other side, doing exactly the same thing. Yeah, that is now a much better mannequin to animate with.